It's wonderful to be talking today about metadata matters, aligning people, process, and technology. A very interesting topic, especially with where we stand with the rise of content, the demand of content, and the ever-evolving searchability. So I'm Brian Gavin, joined alongside John. John, thank you so much for joining us and representing Salt Flats and all of the metadata expertise.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Thank you for joining. We have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to kind of bring us through the first kickoff, which is just to pull the audience and to know a little bit about what people understand in terms of their current metadata structure and where we are in terms of maturity. So I'm going to just pull my screen up here, and we are going to kick off a quick poll, which is, do you know your metadata? Do you know what's happening within the organization? And so you should be being presented with a poll that can tell you, one, do you know what's happening in your company in terms of metadata? Give us a yes. No if you're not involved in the company's metadata, or you're not aware about how your company strategizes against using metadata. And if it's totally foreign, just say what and give us that feedback. We'd love to incorporate your feedback from this poll into today's conversation. So we'll let that poll just close out, and we will jump into our screen share, which should allow us to go about today's conversation. So let me just make sure that I'm sharing my screen here today, and we are going to jump right into our introduction about Global Edit. So as I mentioned, my name is Brian Gavin. I am leading Global Edit. We are the leading enterprise creative workflow management solution for visual assets. Global Edit is all about helping you as a brand, as a content creator, move your content from the point of capture just after it's produced in studio or on location, and moving it through those crucial work in progress steps that allow you to get content out in the wild. And we've been working with some of the leading brands for over a decade now, and are really excited with the rebirth of our platform to be powering content at scale. We are a part of an integrated family of production companies, and those are Smashbox Studios, if you are familiar, across the West Coast and East Coast, providing premier photo and video studio access. Industrial Color, which is our creative agency, handling full-scale end-to-end production, pre-production and post-production. And then, of course, backed up by Global Edit, which from a SaaS perspective helps power some of the leading brands around the world. Those are represented from folks like Old Navy, Discovery, Victoria's Secret, and BarkBox. We are so excited to get to work with our customers day in and day out about how they produce e-commerce editorial content from a brand perspective, but as well as on the media entertainment side, we work with a lot of original content and theatrical content creators to produce unit and gallery photography and any of those supporting key art pieces. Global Edit has been in the business for over 20 years and are really excited to be welcomed today by John, who leads Salt Flats as their executive creative director. And John, I want to give you the forum to kick off today's discussion. Help us learn a little bit about who you are from a background perspective, and also what Salt Flats is all about from a metadata perspective.
Thank you very much, Brian. Curious to see the results of that metadata question. Hopefully it was yeses. I do know a little bit more, but let's see. My name is John Hordisky. I'm an executive director with Salt Flats. We are an innovation platform that helps change things in all your brands. The work that I'm involved with is more of the insights and analytics team, which works with all those good things like digital asset management, content management, marketing technology, obviously metadata, taxonomy, all those good things. I've been doing this for over 20 years now. Started my career at Electronic Arts doing work with them. I've been very fortunate to have been working with a lot of other agencies since then in the consulting sphere, Fortune 10, 50 and up, whether it's CPG or retail, media and entertainment, pharma, healthcare, insurance, all those brands, because they all need that metadata goodness. I'm also an adjunct faculty at San Jose State University, where I teach a graduate course in digital asset management. I've been doing that for over 15 years now. Do a lot of public speaking around the world with some conferences, do a regular blog for CMS Wire, 2 books, one on digital asset management in 2016, and the newest book, if we can move the slide, is Metadata Matters. Very proud of this book. Came out in April of this year. And we are going to be giving away 10 copies of this today. We're going to do a random draw, and we will be giving away some copies of this. Very proud of this book. This has been going on for years, and finally I just said, let's just talk about metadata in this specific good way. So yeah, very proud to have that come out in April, and we'll be giving some of those away today.
And John, it seems like we did get some early results from the pullback. Just so we know our audience today, about 80% of the folks that are joining us today do use metadata within their organization and are aware about the strategy. The other 20%, just a flat no, that's not a part of their day-to-day. So I think that helps us understand a little bit about who's with us today, and for the folks that are going to listen to this after, because the webinar is being recorded. We would love to hear the wisdom from the perspective of organizations that maybe are a little bit more mature in their metadata usage, but for those 20% that it's new, how do we get started? So thank you so much for kicking us off. And from a poll perspective, we have an audience who's in tune with metadata does matter.
Awesome.
So when we talk about metadata mattering, John, and how does it matter, it's more about it just being snippets of information on an asset, right?
Right. I mean, we always say in the simplest, sometimes simplest is best, but the simple definition of metadata is just literally data about data. The two words put together literally mean that, but in fact, it's just not that. There's a whole bunch more stuff that metadata does for us. And I wanted to break down some sort of definitions. I'm a big believer in definitions. So if we look at the next slide, there is actually sort of a formalized definition from NISA, which is the National Institute of Standards Organization. They break it down into 3 categories, and I actually applaud this. I like breaking it down this way. So we've got descriptive metadata. These are all the things we need to describe resources. They're all little things like things that you would include in a search. So subject, creator, date, location, keywords, all the little descriptive things about the content you're working with. Now you have something as well as structural or technical metadata. That is all, you take a photograph or a video, all that sort of stuff that comes with it. Sometimes it's known as EXIF data, file format, the dimension of the file, the length, the size, all those good things, how long the video is. Those are the structural pieces of metadata. They're actually quite important for many of us in the work we do. If we're editing or if we're doing review and approvals, we do need some of that technical metadata. And the third category is known as administrative metadata. This is interesting because it provides help around 2 sort of big issues. One is rights management, and the second is preservation metadata. Now, I'm assuming many people who are attending today and who will be listening afterwards, rights management might be an issue that you will have to deal with some of your content. So all the IP that you own, what can you do with the asset? Is it for print only? Is it for social media? Is it for the web? What else? But those pieces of metadata will help manage the rights of the content you have. And the second part of administrative metadata is very much about the preservation metadata. Some of us may want to keep the content beyond its regular life cycle. They may want to use it in the future, so they sort of may have archival purposes, and that metadata is very specific to know who has it, where it is, what can be done with it. Is there a physical copy? Is it an original? So by having that administrative metadata will help manage the life cycle of an asset, whether that's an image, whether that's a logo, whether that's a video, well beyond its natural life cycle. So put those 3 together, and that gives us a little bit more about metadata, but there is actually still much more to say about the value of metadata. So 3 things I wanted to present today to sort of inspire everyone who's attending is that, why does metadata matter? Well, it's going to give us the structure and the meaning to everything that we do in our business and personal transactions. So our content that we see in our business, the content that we use with our customers, B2C, B2B, other, the metadata gives it that structure so it can be used in better ways. Similarly, in our personal transactions, whether that's the seats our preferences on an airline, the tracking that we use for our favorite music service, it gives the structure and meaning behind those things. But what's also really important about metadata is that it defines us at any given point in time. as world changes, as our assets change, as our cultural norms change, so too can the metadata. But it's really interesting just to remember that it defines us where we are. So 2022, the metadata we're using now, it is respectful of what we're seeing, the belief systems that we have. But over time, as things change, which we know that the business needs change, the products and services might change, the users themselves, and even the language might change, and your metadata needs to adapt over time to stay relevant to the people who are trying to use your content. Those are 3 good reasons why metadata does matter. And hopefully for those attending or listening, that can inspire us to maybe think a little bit different about the content that we have. All right, now let's get some examples of, for those of you who may be thinking, what do you mean? I thought metadata was done, I did it, I gave it to somebody else, the asset was used. True, but it's really never done because the language of the content that we use, that's never done. It's always in a state of change. And in fact, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, as some of us might know, over 1,000 neologisms. Yes, it's a lovely, interesting word. These are new words and phrases. They're added to the English language on an annual basis, which is just kind of mind-boggling how much the languages are being changed. So this comes from potentially new words being invented. 3 that I found last year where I thought were fascinating that they've actually become words is adorkable. Some of us may have used adorkable in the sentence. Adulting, that's embarrassing, but it is a word now. But some of us, are you saying, am I adulting today? That is a proper word that's being used. And the 3rd one was zhuzh. Now, I thought zhuzh was already a word, but apparently it's not. And zhuzh is, to make yourself look really, glamorous. And I'm going out on the town tonight. Have you zhuzhed up? Hilarious, but new words are always being added. So don't ever think the metadata is done because language will be there. But we also see interesting things where new meanings for existing words, example, drone, a remote aerial vehicle, it's changed to something else. So again, language is evolving, but let's have some fun. Here's 2 examples of where metadata can be fun, where we think the content is where we think it is, but do we know the audience? So I take a look at this and I do love a good cookie. I say cookie. I'm in Canada, in the United States, that's what you say. However, if you're in the UK, you would say it's a biscuit. In France, biscuit en français. In Australia, it's actually a bicky. And in Japan, it's a cookie. The image is the same, but the word potentially might be different. So again, ask yourself, with my imagery, and the metadata associated to it, who are the users of this material? Now, if you look at the next example, again, food is the theme here today. Chips and crisps. Again, I would look at these and go, I'm hungry for some chips. In a different society, in a different part of the world, they would look at these and say these are crisps. Again, same image, different thing. What I find also interesting about this image is that this is the same company, salt and vinegar, still my favorite chip. They changed the color of the bag, so which I found very interesting, green, blue, and pink. Again, when we think about the content that we're dealing with, whether it's imagery or videos or other, the metadata is very important to these. And again, chips and crisps to the wrong audience may confuse the audience, and then metadata is important to ensure that we're making more meaning for what we have. Another example that I wanted to demonstrate in terms of why metadata matters in terms of language is we got to be mindful of the things around us. Many of us are in CPG, retail, pharma, insurance, other, dealing with big brands, but we sometimes need to look outside to potentially help influence what we do in the inside. Now, at one point it was, and the winner is. We know where it's going with that. We know what the next line should be. But in 1998, it was actually switched to "and the Oscar goes to." And then it was replicated with "and the Emmy goes to" and the Grammy goes to, focusing on the individual, not necessarily, everyone's a winner in this instance. So let's just say that this person is getting the Oscar. Again, you're rewarding the prize and the person, not necessarily. But look at the second one, from diet to zero. Now, soda pops and carbonated beverages at one point were diet. That was the word associated to it. But think of the big interest that the brands had to do to sort of switch that over. And now we're using a lot of words like zero. It means a lot. It's zero would have never made sense in the early 80s, mid 90s if we were drinking zero drinks. But in 2022, zero actually has a lot of meaning behind it now. And it's sort of an accepted term. So again, language is never done. Similarly, VD, STD, and STI. So in the 1990s, during the AIDS epidemic, the term venereal disease actually became known as STD, a sexually transmitted disease. That actually even further involved, to reduce the stigma behind these words, to sexually transmitted infection. Again, the word had evolved, it changed, it became more respectful and inclusive, and that's the power of language. Similarly, with identity and cisgender and trans, it wasn't until 2007 in academia that the word cisgender was actually being used, and actually became added to the OED in the English language in 2015. So we are always have to be mindful of our culture, of our audience, and the words around us to help influence potentially some of the metadata words that we are trying to choose. So always be mindful.
I think, John, and this lines us up for a really interesting snapshot and focus into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and talking about that taxonomy being more than data. So walk us through kind of the trends from a 2022 perspective, as we actually are now in Q4 in a crazy way.
Here we go. I mean, it's almost 2023. That's sort of amazing and impossible all at the same time.
Right.
But with the slide, what I wanted to present was take a look at the other things that might be influencing us. And I know many of the people in the call, maybe you're actually doing some of these things. So at the top, you have metadata. Again, we sort of established it's more than just data about data, but then we have taxonomy. So if you think of data as the little bits and bobs to define objects, taxonomies could be ways to sort of organize them all into categories. Again, when you go into a grocery store, you see dairy, you see vegetables, you see meats. These are categorizations. So too, we need to categorize our brands in different ways, but that does change over time. In fact, now we have things like ontologies. Big scary word, many of us are using them, and if you're not, it's okay if you're not using an ontology, but take a look at the taxonomy and then add a layer to it so you're actually making relationships between the words that you are using. It's very popular in e-commerce to have ontologies to make sure people can find things in many different ways. The next one on top of that is something known as a knowledge graph, which is basically just a visualization of ontologies. But again, it's taking that next step up, so we're ensuring that, again, people are able to find what you're looking for. From there, we go straight up to what we're seeing as Web 3.0, which is also known as the semantic web. And that's sort of taking those sort of decentralized data stores and making them more machine accessible. So the intranet, the web, other things are able to start creating better versions and understanding the data and the relationships between everything. And then the last thing that we're seeing right now with many of our clients is people starting to think about the metaverse. Very well used word. Some of us might be familiar with NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which I still think is a very strange word myself, but we're hearing about that. And some brands are saying, okay, we figured out print, we figured out web, social, now there's a new channel potentially, and that could be the metaverse. And that's just metadata exploding. You know, we want to make sure if you are thinking about going into the metaverse, do I have a good metadata foundation to help me get there? Will my brand look the same? Will there be rules to help me get into the metaverse so that my brand can be used? What if your brand was being misused, et cetera, et cetera? But it is something to think about, and it might not be in your forecast for 2023, 24, but I think it could be, you know, good to start thinking about where that could go. So that's some of the trends we're seeing with data, but now I think it's good to talk a little bit about the next topic, Brian, which is diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, again, this is a topic that has sort of always been with us, but since Black Lives Matters and other sort of social events, this has become very important to us. And before I go to the next slide, I just wanted to very briefly sort of define diversity, equity, inclusion, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. So again, diversity, that's defined as differences in race, color, place of origin, religion, immigrant and newcomer status, ethnic origin, ability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and age. That's what we're thinking, and that's sort of an agreed upon term of what diversity is. But when you look at the next level down on equity, that's sort of defined as the removal of systemic barriers and biases, enabling all individuals to really have equal opportunity to access and benefit from whatever the program might be. Third one is inclusion. Now that's defined as the practice of ensuring that all individuals are valued and respected for their contributions, and they're being equally supported doing so. Why is this relevant for metadata? Think again of some of the examples we've been using with the content that we have. think of those of you who are on this call and the webinar today, the imagery and the people you might have in your shots and the advertisements. How are we thinking about that? So with that, and then on the next slide, we created sort of a top 10 DEI questions. Now, diversity, equitability, inclusion, and even accessibility. So for those of you who are thinking, yeah, how do I tag people now? This is something very interesting. You know, what if I tag them differently maybe years ago? How do I go back? So 10 things to really think about. You know, do you and your organization have any guidelines around how to actually to do sort of metadata for tagging, etc.? The creators, who's actually creating the content? Is it all sort of homogenous, or are there differences? There are very good examples of coded bias where the people doing the coded might be just all white males. Well, perhaps we should have, you know, people from different backgrounds who are able to code and do the things to give us a better perspective. You know, do you have a proper lens or governance that can help you going forward? Again, the people, who's managing this? Do we have, you know, differences in our organization, which then slips into the next one, which is audience. I mean, how well do we really know our audience? If with marketing or creative industries trying to look at society and saying, how do I affect them? How well do we really know them? Do we know who they are and how they self-identify when we try and do that? Bias, always good to realize that there is some bias with all of us. So let's look at the code, let's look at the technology, let's look at how we look at our imagery and how we sell our imagery in a world to say, what are those biases? Can we talk about it? Now, obviously 7, a good metadata foundation will help you get there. But 8, look at the technology that can interact with all that we're trying to do. Artificial intelligence, Brian, you know as well as I do, it's a very popular topic, but how are the machines going to learn if they're using bad metadata from the beginning? You know, let's make sure we have a good foundation. And that's where the algorithms come in. You know, how well are they doing? How often are we going back and actually looking at the algorithms to say, how is the metadata doing? Am I talking to my users? Am I getting them? Am I interacting with them the way they want? So just be mindful to go back. Obviously, number 10, let's say, you know, if we are being, and as I say here, if diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, equity is curating the playlist and doing more. So where are we all in that thing? Again, 10 good things to consider today. And if this can inspire you to potentially have new governance in your organization or just think differently about the content you have and that you're trying to manage in your creative operational work or other, just be mindful that the metadata is important and it needs to be sort of managed as it evolves with language over time. So hopefully something in there can inspire us to be a little bit different and better going forward.
John, it's inspiring me, and we're going to talk just a minute about global edit and how we think about metadata. But you brought up 2 pieces, and I'm sure this will come up as we converse more. But one is on the AI side of, you know, computer enriched attributes of a photo or a video. And one of the pieces that I've been so interested about, and I'm going to kind of go off the cuff on this just for 1 second, because John, the ethics and standard piece about the interpretation of content is really reached the research and higher education level of, you know, what's the philosophy and standards on how AI should influence interpretation and a actual human's view on content, which I think is just, that's fascinating in itself. And for organizations that are investing in AI, having that ethics role and compliance role to think about what's right for the human evolution of interaction with content is just really fascinating. So I just wanted to go back and just mention that I think for folks that said yes, 80% of us today are actually thinking about metadata, is how, when you're advancing metadata, now we're ready to, you know, use Amazon recognition. We've had a lot of good conversations with the AWS team about how you can use solutions like that to enrich your content. Is what's the ethic and standards that your brand needs to run by. So thank you for raising that piece. The piece and the component about global edit from a workflow perspective is we look at digital asset management and metadata from the very beginning stages. And I think, you know, if we go back to the 3 categorical types of metadata, the structural metadata actually exists on content when it's coming out of the camera. And that's so important and crucial that brands have access to metadata, to have that understanding about the date and the camera and all of the other components that went into creating that asset. When you think about work in progress and you're making your selects, you're handling versions through retouching, you're getting approvals, this iterative process of work in progress is the same iterative approach that we believe metadata goes through, because you unknowingly or knowingly put metadata on the asset when you process that JPEG or the TIFF from a raw point of view. And then you've gone through and you've started to iterate and thinking about it as an organization. Do you have a centralized place that your digital asset manager, someone who's holistic to taxonomy for content, actually thinks about how does my work in progress process impact the end state of metadata, and is there someone that should be looking even further upstream from a typical dam where the finalized assets are? The collaboration, and one thing that you called out, John, that got me really excited is when we collaborate, there's often hesitation from brands to give early access to content because those rights, the final approvals on those assets and making sure that we're working with the right version, all that goes into kind of coupling asset rights needs to be protected. And when you think about work in progress potentially exists across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different systems, the component that Global Edit thinks about is how do you bring in all of that work in progress into one system? And that means that folks that want to collaborate on assets because you have asset rights actually tied up front, because you have the proper metadata stored, it allows you to kind of expose work in progress assets to folks in marketing and other teams that don't need to wait to the finalized state. And certainly from a storage and distribution standpoint, it goes into making sure that you know when those assets expire, how do you pull them down from marketing campaigns, and that goes to think about what does metadata mean. And I think this is really powerful from our point of view in Global Edit, where we have millions of records or billions of records of metadata across tens of millions of assets. That's impressive, but I think we still, as a brand and a company who focuses so much on workflow efficiency from enriching content with metadata, just over 50% of our brands who use Global Edit enter in custom descriptive metadata about their assets. That might have to do with the product, the brand itself, how you express yourself, how you, again, back to the DEI component of what you talked about, John, think about who your audience is. Do you know who your audience is? I'd love to see that number closer to 80%. So I think the workings of our kind of education to our existing customers and to folks today that, yes, you use metadata, but how do you use metadata holistically across your entire workflow, not just in the DAM space, is so important. And the other component that I think is interesting is for brands who are adopting metadata and thinking about it, not just from a finalized asset perspective, but from a work in progress, is the fields, the volume of attributes that they want to track on assets is pretty extensive, in the mid 30s in terms of attributes. And this is ever evolving. I can't impress upon it, John, I think you mentioned it very early on, which is, hey, do you know that your metadata taxonomy actually evolves, and are you going back and revisiting that? And so one way that we have found clients to very easily manage content certainly is from a PIM perspective if you're living in an e-commerce world, but more and more adoption by the creative teams actually adopting a project management system. A system like Airtable, for example, really allows you to add campaign level attributes, asset level attributes, and even workflow attributes as metadata. And that the more inclusive that the teams can be to structuring metadata on an asset or a set of assets overall, because of the hierarchy that it rolls up to, in my opinion, the better. So if you are, as a brand, thinking about not just your DRM or your PIM system having access to metadata, there's a huge uprise in your project management system actually having key components of metadata that you want to append. And so we're going to get into some quality and best practices from John's point of view. I'm really excited, John, for you to share these before we get about 10 minutes to have a fireside chat on some pretty interesting topics. So from a quality and best practices perspective, What are those? Why does it even matter? And again, I think for me, keeping grounded to the folks here today that might be using metadata already is, what can we do differently?
Absolutely. It's metadata matters for many things, but one of them is the quality sort of assurance or the quality controls behind it. So let's go through a few slides to sort of share with some of those things. Now, I always like to think of it of the why, the how, and the who behind what's going on with your metadata management. Obviously, it's quality. So as we've already sort of established earlier, we know that the business needs are going to change, user needs, language changes, and you need that metadata to be adaptive and to stay relevant in whatever we are in 2022. Is it relevant for today? But here are 4 things to ask yourself. So the why, is it out of date? Brian, you sort of mentioned like quality controls. When was the last time you looked at your metadata? For some organizations, they go, never, or maybe a few years ago. I like to see people looking at metadata at least twice a year. Again, is it out of date? Look how many versions of products come out on a sort of an annual or biannual basis. Is some of the metadata out of date for what we're thinking of? Has the meaning potentially changed over time? The example we had with a drone, there's a word that had one meaning and now it has different. I'm always reminded from my grandfather about hip versus hep. We say that's really hip. They had hep. Like what? Words change over time. So we got to make sure. So are we looking at our metadata and our content saying, has this meaning changed over time? What about if it's damaging now? Maybe the words that we have used in the past without knowing more information, maybe it's potentially damaging. So maybe we need to change that. And then lastly, is it potentially a brand new product, service, or concept? That's a good reason why you need to manage your metadata a little better so you can understand that you can be more responsive. So that's the why part. But now let's talk about some of the how part, or sorry, the who part. So who's going to do this? I've always said to people, metadata, it's not magic, but it can be magical. But you need people throughout the process from the beginning to the end to help this out. Brian, you even mentioned about creators, people at the beginning of the process who are making the video or the image or the graphic. Well, even what about the creative brief one level up? Who's being part of that? So where does some of this metadata management come in? Librarians, very common to have in large organizations, even mid-sized organizations, to have a librarian role. Someone, he, she, they, who are able to sort of look at the metadata on a regular basis, ensure that quality controls are happening, to ensure that the relevancy of those topics are sort of being managed at the year in which it is. But then how about people, we call them representatives or SMEs, the subject matter expertise, people from different sort of business units, products, and services. Are they a part of your metadata management? Are they helping review, again, with good governance? And I'm a big fan of governance. Are people talking about these things? So let's talk about the users. Now, like the creators are doing one side, are you talking to the users of your content systems? Are they finding what they're looking for? Are they saying it should be this? We have many examples of people who look outside the social media to actually come back inside the organization and potentially change product names to help, to be better, more efficient. Microsoft Xbox is a great example from many years ago where they changed the categorization on e-commerce sites and the product sold more because they were looking what social media was telling them. Again, the who, legal. Are you talking to legal? Are they able to tell you what you can and can't do with some of the content you have? And are you putting that metadata in so people are saying, this is the approved logo, I see it, I'm allowed to use it, as opposed to maybe I'll just go to the internet, right click and take a logo? Yeah, no, that's not going to work. So make sure legal are involved in metadata management. And then finally, I'm a big believer in telling everyone about this. So how's your executive team? Are they thinking about these things? They're seeing the value of what metadata can do, the cost efficiencies and the return on investment behind a good metadata initiative. So definitely the who part is very important. And I think those are 5 good examples of good who. Now, the last one though is the how part. So do you have documented workflows for metadata maintenance? It sounds simple, but I can tell you, after doing this for 20 years, a lot of times we don't really have this documented down. I'm a big believer in workflow, and I know Brian is as well. Much of what we can do is all about creative workflows, but how are we getting the metadata in there and managing them? Do you have documentation how you add terms and who gets to add those terms? Similarly, who gets to remove and when do you remove terms? What's the frequency of review? I sort of hinted at this earlier. Are you just like, maybe we do it once a year, or maybe we haven't looked at it in a while? That's important. Is there additional approval needed potentially when you are making changes to your metadata? And then who's informed of this? You need to tell your users the metadata of this object has changed over since the last time you use it. Fun examples of an organization, I say kitten, Brian says cat, someone says felis catus. They're all the right word, but if we're going to be kitten people in this company, we need to sort of socialize that and say, when you see this type of an image or when this product goes out, we refer to it as this, not the other words. If you want to talk about the other words, let's do that at our next governance meeting so we can talk about maybe potentially changing those things. So I think those are good how statements to help inspire people today. Now, best practices, big believer in the best practices for any part of business, but I do believe here are 5 things that I can sort of inspire people today with. Number 1, a content assessment. All that really is going back into your catalog, going back into all the assets you're creating. Many of us work on seasonal calendars, the spring line or, spring product launches. Go back, take a look at all that content you have. How much of it do you have? Where is it? Do you have the rights for these content? How is it being organized? What's the currency? Are you keeping Macromedia Dreamweaver files from 1993 for some strange reason? I don't know. But let's go assess the content we have so we better understand that we can do behind it. Number 2, metadata is a human endeavor. Again, you need people to make all this stuff work. So let's make sure there's people behind the scenes to help make this metadata go. As I just sort of said, review your metadata twice a year. Leaves looking to see, is it sort of there? And you want to monitor it, you want to analyze it, adjust and repeat on an ongoing basis. Big believer in analytics. Go see how people are searching, what's working, but what's not, and adjust to ensure that the metadata is working for your users. And then lastly, governance. As I said before, it's not an option anymore. If you're not doing governance, I highly encourage you to go get some people, meet on every 2 months or so and start doing better governance for the metadata and the content you have. To me, it's that important.
We have some really good best practices to transition us into a little bit of a fireside chat where you and I can get intimate on a couple topics that from folks that we talked to leading up to today. And John, you bring a wealth of information. We talk about this metadata maturity model, and for so many, I'm going to go back to the poll, and what we learned from the folks today is, yeah, we're using metadata, but I think where on that Richter scale are we in terms of metadata maturity? What is the, what is utopia from metadata, and what is that maturity alignment to being there and having reached it? Or for folks that are new, yes, we use it, but it's still new and evolving. How do we test ourselves?
How do we test ourselves? And this is a great opportunity for those attending the webinar live right now. This is for you. This is a great time to start thinking of some questions for us. So go to the right hand side to the question area and start firing off some good questions for us. So we have something to sort of go with after this. But you speak of the maturity. I'm a big believer in maturity models. Now, maturity model in business, it's the ability to use criteria to measure yourself against because you want to improve over time. As much as we say we want to be better as we mature with our brand, with our content. But what are the checks and balances? So, is utopia even achievable for our brands? Maybe yes, maybe no, but what are you doing in between? Are you, again, reviewing your content? Are you measuring your metadata success in terms of its inclusivity? Have you updated the content to ensure that you're reflecting the new products and services that your organizations are using? Are you doing such things as, we're folder people, maybe we don't have folders anymore? Do we have better search mechanisms to manage? When was the last time we did like a rights management assessment to get it to a place where we do know what we're using? Yeah.
So can I ask you a question? Where is all of the metadata? Like within an organization, hiding under a rock or hiding in my photo that I processed out of Capture One.
Right.
How did we get there? Where is all of this metadata coming from?
It's in all those places, hopefully not under rocks, but it is when we take an image, when we create a thing, an asset, it's right there. File type, file name, what is it? Again, for those who create these things on a regular basis, at right at the point of creation, tell what the asset is, what it's used for, is it part of a creative brief, is it part of a seasonal campaign? So at a lower level, it's all part of those things. But going forward, do you have just even a lovely Excel spreadsheet, maybe even Airtable, where you see your fields that are being used, and then the field descriptions and all the metadata bits inside of those? That's where it should leave. And when you have it there as a living document, you can evolve it, adapt it, and change it over time. Also, you can take that metadata model then and put it into a different system. So many of us will upgrade our pieces of technology over time, but the metadata as a standalone living document that can follow you over time with new technology. So that's where I'd like to see it living. And maybe for those of you on the call today, you're thinking, I need to think about that. That's good. That's a good thing.
The XMP standard that you want your data to be structured in makes it so that it's easily transferable, has that iterative approach. I think, John, what was so interesting is, 2 times per year, we should review our metadata taxonomies. For clients that are using metadata in Global Edit in the earlier stages, the whole taxonomy may not be reviewed, but those values are actually iterative from the photographer who captured to the art director or the e-commerce manager who preps it before it goes live to the website, to then someone who says, hey, we actually need to optimize what our consumers are searching for. Let's change these. So it's beyond just a taxonomy being looked at 2 times per year. You actually need to look at your metadata throughout the creative evolution of your assets.
Absolutely. We've seen instances where people, before they even do the photo shoot, so there's going to be a photo shoot live in Hawaii, there's going to be mountains, there'll be beaches. People are already building in sort of keywords at the beginning with the creative brief saying, so we're going to take a whole bunch of imagery for the organization. There'll be beach shots, so a lot of sandy beaches, a lot of blue water. There'll be jungle imagery. There'll be mountains and lush green images. Those keywords are already happening, let alone this is for the 2024 spring campaign, brand X, et cetera, all that metadata can even start right at the beginning of the process to help maximize the efficiency going forward, as opposed to halfway through the year, people are like, what is that again? Where, what? Let's try and answer those questions as early on as possible. I think that's a good efficiency.
Efficiency is key. That's a buzzword that you and I circle through a lot. So there's probably some obvious use cases of what we're supposed to do with metadata. Maybe highlight on a couple of those, but are there some newer trending use cases of how metadata is being used within organizations as well that you see?
Yeah, 2 things we've learned from the pandemic was, as people went remote, as people went and had to sort of work in sort of different collaborative environments. One is the use of like such collaborative tools like a Miro board to help brainstorming exercises, to help people get together in disparate locations, remote locations, and say, let's break down a topic. Let's say spring collection or whatever that, or product X. Break down, get some of those keywords right out from the beginning. That can help sort of generate new ideas. So we're all sort of on the same page of like the content that we're managing. Similarly, though, with technology being an influence upon it, what are some of those best case scenarios where we can say, like an Airtable potentially, a sort of a nice way to manage the content to make it more accessible. Some of the big trends that we've seen recently has been good old-fashioned just a governance program, helping feed things like AI and ML, so artificial intelligence, machine learning. People sometimes will go into it too fast potentially and not necessarily have all the foundational elements needed. Again, those robots need good food of data. If you give them bad data, they will only learn as much as they can. So we've seen the trend where a lot of people are taking the time at the beginning of the process to ensure some of those things are happening as early as possible. So the robots are learning, the machines are getting faster, better, stronger over time. Those are some of the few things we've definitely seen over the last few years as we've come out of this pandemic.
It's really insightful, and you just touched on some of the major value adds. As a business leader, maybe within creative or marketing or within taxonomy and in the metadata realm that we've been talking about, how do we build a strategy that drives organizational benefit. And I think, you touched on this, that it's not just the librarian. There's legal that thinks about it, and all of these, there's a multitude of teams. So how do we as a business leader think more holistically for the organization's benefit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that business leaders need a little sort of a nudge or an inspiration to sort of say, what are we doing here? I think it comes down to, good old economics. And like we mentioned before, like a maturity model. It's that
Yep.
return on investment, are we better? We've seen many examples with better use of metadata management, that products could be sort of built, created faster because people aren't wasting time. I think the average is still around 60% of time people are looking for things. That's too much time. I think we should be doing something different with that time, not looking for it, phoning people, even going back to old school saying, where's that asset? With better metadata, I think we can serve better efficiencies behind that. So I think anyone listening today who is in that sort of a business management role saying, how can we do this better? Look at the processes, manage the metadata right from the beginning all the way through so that we're making those efficiencies at every opportunity of the workflow process all the way out the door. We've seen many organizations who, and Brian, you and I have joked about this, about like the final fear. It's final number 1, final 2, final _001. Which one's the final asset? We potentially, for legal reasons, we want to know these things. So look for efficiencies at every step of the way of your product or content creation from the beginning right to the end. Again, creative briefs right at the beginning, product shots. Who's going to be there? Do we have consent forms? Do we have the consent forms with identification of who they are in terms of their gender expression? Let's get all this stuff. Let's start preparing much more at the beginning. That will give better efficiencies down the road and better sort of realizations of the return on investment that you can do with your content. Metadata is directly tied into that. So let's just take the time to do a better bit of pre-planning at the beginning, I guess.
For me, I mean, it seems like, and we use metadata for our own assets. So how we want to represent Global Edit in the marketplace is, it needs to be a holistic conversation to those that are pulling content. Are you getting what you need? Does your search engine, does your search results give you back what you need? How can we do more intelligent routing of content based upon metadata that is being added in a more iterative approach? And the third, and I think this is the most impactful, this is what we're all working towards, which is how do we reach our consumer? And a consumer might have a different definition if we're producing a new film, and that viewer is our consumer. How do we get those eyes on our new film and our new production? Or if we're on the e-commerce side, how do we get that buyer? And I think there's a lot of interesting technologies that if brands are investing in rigid metadata structures, we can actually start to produce more efficient content as a result of knowing this button down and the hero, the side, the alt view is what actually matters. What are users, consumers actually engaging with? And it kind of comes back to, do you have metadata? Do you know what this is?
When was the last time, as I sort of speak virtually to the attendees, when was the last time you looked at your search query logs, both from your internet, your intranet, your e-commerce sites? What are people looking for? You'll be interesting to see what people are looking for. Does it match up, like you say? Is it a collared shirt? Is it a polo? Is it a V-neck? Is it a crew? This makes a difference, and the consumers are looking and the expectations are there and they don't see it because of poor metadata. That's not good enough, I think, in 2022. I think we need to be much better. And you also touched upon something else, Brian, in terms of like the global reach. Many of us on this webinar today work in global organizations, which means the audience potentially changes region to region. We've seen examples where people in one region will refer to a product as healthcare related. You go to a different region, same product, that is now seen as a beauty product. Again, same product, 2 different emotive responses. The metadata must match those things, because when you market that product, you want to make sure you're marketed in the right way. So the consumers, you want those consumers to find this. It's so funny, but it always comes down to, you want your content to be found. So what's the best way of doing that? Some good old metadata.
Metadata matters. So we're going to wrap up with, why does it matter? I'm going to put my screen back up and look at, why does metadata matter? Walk us through the 10
Sure.
plus bullet points of what do we take away from today after 50 minutes of understanding metadata matters.
Yep. So these are just some fun snippets. Metadata is a program, not a project. By definition, a project begins and ends. Metadata goes on. So that it seems subtle, but think about that. You need to finance it better. You need to staff it better. So it's a program. It keeps going, which is part of number 2, which is that it's a human endeavor. Again, you need people behind the scenes to really help the metadata be managed better. So just make sure, that there are people behind the scenes doing this. Metadata, it's the foundation for everything your organization is going to do with content. So it's that important from the product sort of brief creative level. The metadata is going to follow it through. So make sure it's there. We need metadata for workflow to work. I'm a huge fan of workflow, creative, production, distribution. There's workflows for all these things. When does the metadata come in? Who's putting it in? Is it being reviewed and approved? I mean, metadata makes workflow work better. And if those of you on the webinar today who's ever done like a workflow exercise, you know how important that sort of metadata flow throughout that cycle is important to you. You need it for artificial intelligence and machine learning to work. So many people will go fast out of the gate for an AI project and say, let's do everything. Why don't we do it a little bit smaller in scope? Maybe we'll take one product line. Maybe we just take lifestyle imagery. Maybe there's a few fields, such things as like the color of, what's the primary color in this image? Little things like that. Start small, make sure the metadata is working for the AI, and then start to go a little bit out further there. As I've always said, that social media is kind of like metadata and drag. That hashtag certainly is great metadata. And your governance council, make sure you have a social media person there and say, so what are you seeing on the outside to help us on the inside? It's very important. And it is the lifeblood, whether it's a digital asset management, a product information management, content management system, anything in MarTech or creative operations, metadata is that sort of connector. It's the lifeblood. But also for fun, yes, it is a snapshot in time. It is freaking awesome. I've heard many clients say that, which I think is lovely. And for anyone on the webinar today who loves to play in the social media space, hashtag metadata matters, hashtag I love metadata. And the last one, metadata is not anonymous. No, it's not. It's very much not.
It doesn't, and it will not be after today. So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to round out by just, there's a few questions that did come in from the audience and want to make sure we address those. So first, we'll start with the most abstract one, John, which is, metaverse. We've seen some brands make an early run at it, but I guess there's a desire to know some of the themes that we're seeing across how metadata, the metaverse is incorporated with metadata.
And it's funny, I was flying yesterday and I did happen to see a bookstore in the airport, and there's already a book on the metaverse, and I sort of giggled a little bit because we're not even there yet. Like, we're so early on. Do we even know what we're talking about? Very similar to when social media first kicked in. We were all wondering, how do I interact with social media? Well, so too with the metaverse. If you do have a brand, it might now be a new channel for you. So you may have things in print, you may have things in digital, you may have an e-commerce site, but now what about the metaverse? Well, the metaverse is sort of like the true wild, wild west. There's no rules. There's sort of no laws to govern it. So if you are going to go into the metaverse, you want to make sure that your brand is being protected with good metadata in terms of what it can do, and then socialized in the way. So how do you want your product and brand to be used? Metadata can help out in the metaverse. I mean, it's kind of sort of ironic that Meta and metaverse, I mean, they're all about the aboutness of things. So I would just encourage anyone on the call today, if you are thinking about going into the metaverse, take some time, think about really how you want your brand to be used, and how, again, when you're in the metaverse, people will be searching for things. Search is driven by metadata. Let's just make sure we have good metadata behind our content that could be exposed in the metaverse so it can be used and found in the way that you're intending it to be used.
Foundation is everything. Next one is, when you work with e-commerce brands in particular, I think is there a lens through the SEO and SEM filter of acquisition and relevancy to the search engines that we should be looking at metadata around?
Oh, absolutely. Those things, SEO, metadata, the hashtag, they're all very much connected together. So again, when you do like a content assessment or even a metadata review of your content, take a look at those things. What is the way to optimize your e-commerce sites to allow some of the keywords, those metadata terms, Are they being used in the right way? Again, we've seen examples where products had changed due to how society was sort of, watching it. One example was wearables, a term that was never had before, but, watch was a word. The company switched it to wearables and their product sold even more. So again, SEO is important. The metadata, the hashtags that are being used outside of your organization certainly can influence opportunities for you to either improve or potentially change a few things for your products and services to be found better and ultimately accessed and then sold. So
I mean, it just gets back to that lens, John, which is like you have to look at metadata from all of the teams that touch the product, the consumer, because we wouldn't have known that it was to be wearable unless we were looking at search reports about how our buyers were trying to find us, but we didn't even get to show up. So
it's not
inclusivity.
it's not in isolation, right? I mean, the very famous phrase from many years ago was, "In splendid isolation, we shall survive." No, metadata is collaborative. I want the creative people in the room. I want the marketing people there. I want the graphic team. I want the business team. I want the legal team. Let's talk about our products. Let's talk about our services. It seems like this seems like it should be happening, but I can tell you a lot of people don't. So I encourage people to be collaborative with your products, your services, get all those different types of people in the room. There is power of collective intelligence. The singularity of people with the same mindset is good. Go get a collective intelligence session with different people talking about the same product and service. You'll do far better, a better holistic view of your products and services going forward and the metadata surrounding those terms. Yeah, good.
Cool. John, I'm going to take us right to the 2 o'clock Eastern mark. So because we do have just a few more questions. So I'm really, it's so interesting to me. So I'm going to, I know the audience was hungry. So we're going to go to the next one, which is having an existing repository of content in the tens of thousands. You get North, this in particular person has about 30,000 visual assets in their DAM. Keywording has been, manually keywording content has been the primary means that they've enriched content, especially it's from an editorial lens, so it's dynamic in characteristics. Can you automate that keywording? How do you scale getting content tagged? And is there a better means than the human eye?
Correct. So that is a great question, and there are mechanisms to do that. Obviously, with the and again, 10 years ago, if we would have said artificial intelligence, we probably would have pulled back a little bit and said, really, it's kind of science fiction-y. You think of HAL, sorry, Dave, I can't do that. But now artificial intelligence is beginning to work. But again, you start with levels of where it could work very well. The color, let's just go after color. Again, what's the color? What's the primary color of the shot? If I see, what Brian's wearing, it's a white shirt. I'm wearing a royal blue. Can color be identified? That is working okay. But then what are the other layers? So again, there's so many such subjectivity behind such imagery. I may see an image and think that's happy and positive, and it's a great summer image. You might see it and go, it's a little bit depressing. That might not be the same sort of idea that you might go with it. So again, with better creative briefs at the beginning of the process to influence the tagging, you are able to affect that. But yes, over time, what we're seeing is that the machines are learning better. They'll be able to recognize the products a lot more, and some of the keywording that used to be very manual is now being removed with more automated, but then with people on the other end to do quality control and go, yes, yes, yes. I would never want to see anything go out of the door too fast without having the human being sort of look at it. Still a big believer in humans. I think they're pretty good. So let's make sure that they're part of that quality control.
And the adaptation that our role takes as someone who manages metadata may not be from a tagging perspective, but is to set up confidence intervals in what's your threshold for what you review, and you have those efficient ways to actually manage queues of questionable content that or didn't meet a threshold versus we have to look at everything, right? So your dynamic and your approach changes to leverage the machine, if you will, to some extent.
And again, with good governance, you're able to evaluate this on a fairly rigorous, regular basis to see, hey, the machines are working okay. I think we're making some progress here, as opposed to turn a button on and say, I hope it works. No. You want to make sure you're engaging, doing quality review checks to ensure that the analytics are there to support the, how well the machines are learning, so you do get better tags. Who knows?
Well, we're at just at the last minute mark here. This time flew by. Very interesting. There, for any questions that we did not answer, John and I will follow up directly to help answer those. You have my information at Global Edit. You have John's as well. I want to just close out by thanking you for raining your wisdom down on us today, John. I learned a lot. I hope our audience does. We're going to be distributing this to folks who want to watch it on demand, who maybe registered but couldn't make it today. There are 10 folks who will win a copy of your book. Thank you. It's sitting on my desk right here. And with that, we'll conclude today's discussion. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Brian.